Welcome to another edition of Jstfish Outdoors. Jstfish Outdoors is brought to you by Ranger Boats, where we still build legends one at a time. Yamaha Outboards, the reliable choice. Lowrance Sonar and GPS. Gene LaRue Lures. I'm your host, Dale York, and I designed Jstfish Outdoors to focus on Oklahoma lakes and streams and provide information, tips, and techniques, along with how-to segments for catching everything from crappie to catfish here in our great state. We will also provide tips on equipment, tackle, boating, and much, much more. All of this is aimed at helping you catch more fish and have fun doing it. So grab a cup of coffee, a comfortable chair, and that will bring us to our focus for this week. This week we're going to talk about fall bass fishing, and also going to throw little tidbits in there about my favorite baits for finding them and catching fall bass. You know, many anglers this time of year, they put their boats in the garage, they're pretty much done, and boy, I tell you, the fish get so active this time of year. This is probably in my opinion, my number one time of year for catching not only bass, but having the opportunity to catch a pretty good sized monster fish. They're all up chasing the shad. They're very active. Many times they're very willing participants to eat about anything you throw in front of them. Everything from spinner baits to topwaters. It can just be a wonderful time to be on the water. The fish are very productive. They're very active. And in many cases, you don't have to get up at the crack of daylight to be on the water. In many cases, this time of year, the most productive time can be from, 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon until dark. Many times this time of year, that time frame can really produce a lot of fish for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of my favorite baits, how I fish them, and also talk to you a little bit about locations where I start looking for these fish. The first thing we got to understand is what the fish are doing and where they're doing it. Right now, the fish are just feeding up big time for the fall. They're trying to put as much bulk on. They're trying to eat as much as they can to take them into that dormant period when that water temperature gets, below the 50s and the fish metabolism starts slowing down. And they're just trying to put as much bulk on as possible. And also, by this time of year, many of the items that they normally eat, like the crawdads and other things, are pretty much gone. So what they're really focusing on is they're focusing on shad. And, I can't emphasize this enough, that you have to find the shad to find the fish. Now that doesn't mean that, they're going to be up in real shallow water all the time. You're still going to be able to catch these fish offshore, off of some of these pockets, off of some of these humps, off of some of these ridges, that, are not necessarily up in the back ends of the creeks. These fish, a lot of times this time of year, are just starting to get into their heavy schooling activity. And, if you're fishing shallower water, a technique, for instance, and you're not having much luck, sometimes you can go to the deeper areas, your main creek channels going up into the back end of your creek where you still have 15, 20 foot of water depth, and you fish those bends around those secondary points sometimes, and you can find these fish schooled up, and you can set in one place many times, and catch 10, 12, 15 fish without ever moving. So there are multiple patterns, but they all key around one thing, and that's bait fish. you've got to find the bait fish in order to find these fish. And it's really not that difficult. I mean, one of the things that really, really helps you this time of year is to have that great Lowrance HDS equipment on your boat. And with this great electronics, and especially a side scan capability, if you're fishing the deeper pattern, if you're looking for these fish out off the main banks, if you're looking for those humps and those creek channels and looking for these schooling fish, one of the things you're going to need is you're going to need the shad, and the second thing you're going to need some first class electronics. And, that's where the Lowrance HDS series comes in. It will really, really benefit you when you're looking for these offshore locations this time of year where you've got stacked up fish. It's just so much easier to find the fish, and once you find the fish, to stay on top of the fish and fish the fish. So, think about that. Like I said, the other pattern is the shallow water pattern. And in many, many cases, this shallow water pattern, you can get on these fish and just use that pattern all day long. It is just very predictable as long as the weather conditions, the wind conditions, things of that nature stay consistent. You're not having a rapidly falling lake or things of this nature where they're pulling or generating a lot of water out and the water's falling at a fairly rapid pace. That will definitely reconfigure the fish and make them move. But, this shallow water pattern this time of year is very predictable. The fish are everywhere and nowhere. And what I mean by that, they just scatter out and get after these schools of shad, and they're just eating all they can eat as long as they can eat it. And what I'll take you through right now is kind of some of my first choice, second choice, third choice, so to speak, of how I locate these fish, how I catch these fish, and what I catch these fish on. My first choice of bait this time of year is a swim bait. I like throwing a 4 to 6 inch swim bait. Sometimes a little smaller, depending on whether the primary forage is gizzard or threadfin shad. But I like that 4-inch type swim bait, of course, in a natural shad pattern. If I'm fishing real clear water like Keystone, like Skytook or Tinkular, I'll use a little more translucent color than what I will if I'm fishing a Keystone or a Fort Gibson or a Eufaula. I like a little more solid color when I'm fishing those particular lakes. And normally what I'll throw this on is something like a quarter or 3/8 up to a half-ounce head. Remember, you're fishing shallower water. You're typically fishing water 5 foot and less, and you're looking for these aggressive fish, and you're trying to cover quite a bit of water. You're not necessarily power fishing, but at the same time, you're not out there throwing a jig and pig and seining the water either. So, look at that 4-inch size, 4 to 5 inch size in that quarter to 3/8 ounce head. And, I guarantee you that's one of the baits that is one of my go-to baits this time of year. If the water is a little more stained, one of the things I'll do is throw something with a little chartreuse or a little orange in it. What you want to do is you want to throw that bait out there, start reeling it in, and every so often twitch it and kill the bait. When you're reeling that in, don't just throw it out there and reel it in, do the same thing over and over and over again. Impart a little action to that bait. One of the things that may help you tremendously is doing what I call killing that bait, is to reel that bait 6, 8, 10, 12 foot, twitch your rod tip, make that bait maybe jump up a little bit in the water column, and then stop reeling and kill that bait. A lot of times those fish will follow that bait, and that little jump and then killing that bait will trigger a strike. When just reeling that bait in, that fish may follow it all the way to the boat, but that fish will never take the bait. So think about that. Erratic action is what you want. You want that bait to mimic a dying or injured shad, and you want to excite that fish and trigger that bite. And there's a lot of different things you can do to that swim bait to do that, and there's a lot of different ways you can rig that swim bait to make that happen. But think about that when you're reeling that fish in or reeling that bait in. Is impart some kind of action to that bait that's a little different. And like I said, many times you can you trigger that strike. Target the back of creeks and focus on shallow areas. And even if you find a stump row or a brush pile, something like that, focus on that area. And once again, like I said, focus on doing something different with that bait. That's many times what separates catching a few fish from catching a bunch of fish, is just doing something different with that swim bait. And, rig it on a good hook. Make sure your hook is sharp. Many times you'll feel that fish strike it, and then you'll feel that fish strike it again. Don't get too crazy about the rod set. You don't need to, and especially if you're fishing an exposed hook type situation. Just a swing of the rod or sweep of the rod many times is all you need to set that hook, especially when that hook is exposed out of the plastic. The second thing that I like to fish, or my second choice, and I say that tongue in cheek because my second and third choice is kind of up or down. It just depends on what lake I'm starting on, and in some cases, the water clarity and the time of day. But I put this down as my second choice, and that's a spinnerbait. Spinner baits are my second choice because they can, once again, similar to the swim bait, they can be fished in so many different kind of ways and so many places in the vertical in the water column. You can fish them fast up shallow where you throw that V-wake behind them. You can slow roll them where they're down there 4 or 5 foot. You can put a big Colorado blade on them to really make that thing thump or kick if you're fishing some off-colored water. You can put the willow leaf blades on them if you're fishing a little clear water where you may not want the thump, but you do want the shine or the reflection. They just have a lot of choices that you can do. I prefer to throw the spinner bait in a little more stained water than what I like to throw the swim bait in. There's a point in time there or a point in the water clarity there that I will go to the swim bait or go to the spinner bait, and that kind of becomes a personal preference. But if I can see the shad in the water, if I can physically see the shad in the water swimming around, and see the different schools, and see 4, 5, 6 inches, 8 inches deep in the water column, then typically I'll start with a swim bait. And, I may change colors on the swim bait. I may change weights on the swim bait. And then if I'm not doing any good there, then I may go to the spinner bait. As far as colors, chartreuse and white, it's, in my humble opinion, it's hard to beat chartreuse and white for spinnerbait color, especially around here in northeast Oklahoma. But there's a lot of cases too. I'll throw a solid white. That's probably my two go-to colors when I'm throwing a spinnerbait this time of year. I like the combination of willow leaf and Colorado blade. Sometimes I'll prefer one over the other. I also like, 3/8 up to a half ounce for throwing this time of year. You're typically fishing very shallow. You're not trying to get down there and thump the bottom of the reservoir. So, quarter, 3/8 up to a half, depending on your rod, your line. If you're throwing 20 pound, you may want to go up to a half ounce. If you're throwing 14, you may want to go down to 3/8 or even a quarter. So that kind of depends on the situation that you're throwing there. It's really hard for me to get away from white or chartreuse and white. That's and the other thing I do too on that is I have a personal preference as I like gold blades. Even fishing the clear water, I still tend to go with the gold blades. It just for my personal preference, I've had a lot of good luck fishing the gold blades in those particular color combinations. My third choice, like I said, this was a tough one between second and third, is a hard jerk bait like a Rogue or a Rapala, something of this nature. Those baits are not only good early in the springtime as that water begins to warm, especially in our clear water environments, but they're excellent this time of year as well. I'll throw those things out there, crank them down till I get them 2 or 3 feet below the surface. Then I'll start twitching that bait to the boat, trying to find a twitch combination that the fish will strike, that makes those fish strike. And try a lot of different things. Twitch, twitch, stop, twitch, 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 stop. A lot of different regiments and a lot of different routines. But those fish can really get on those jerk baits this time of year, and it can produce a lot of fish. Once again, you need to mimic the shad patterns. If you're fishing a little off-colored water, you throw a little chartreuse, throw a little orange in there, do something of that nature. If you're fishing more clear water, a more translucent color may be helpful. But you need to mimic those shad patterns, and you're trying to get that jerk bait to resemble a dead or dying shad. An easy meal for these things. The next bait that I would look at would be, of course, a lipless or a square bill crankbait, something that will dive down on the square bill, something that'll dive down a foot or two. On the lipless, of course, you can adjust your weight depending on what water depth you're fishing that lipless bait. But in some situations, that lipless bait will create or generate strikes that the square bill bait won't trigger. So don't be afraid to go from a square bill crankbait to a lipless crankbait, or vice versa. Sometimes doing one or the other can really improve your chances. And then, of course, if none of this works, if you're fishing faster, and like these baits I just outlined, and you're not getting bit, the fish could be what I call a neutral or a negative mood. And when they do that, then you're going to have to totally rethink and slow things down. This is the time when you pull out your wacky worms, you pull out your tube jigs, or even a jig and pig. And I tell you, I've got, you look me up on Facebook or look me up on YouTube, I've got a video out there where I talk about fishing the wacky worm in the fall. And once again, when I have to slow down to get bit, that's one of my favorite techniques that I catch a lot of fish on. I'll throw that on spinning gear many times. I'll throw it on a great 3/0 size hook. Sometimes they want a 4-inch. Sometimes they want a 6-inch on that wacky rig. I'll throw a sluggo, not a sluggo, but just numerous types of different worms in there, or different plastics to that I rig wacky style, and many of those will generate strikes. So think about that. That's just an excellent bait to throw this time of year when you have to fish slower. The fish aren't as aggressive, and you have to slow your presentation down. A lot of times when you have high bluebird skies, where you've got a little bit of wind, we've got a little northern that's blew through, throw that wacky worm. And like I said, once again, throw that on a 4 or throw it on a 6-inch style. And once again, you want to mimic the shad color. Sometimes, like I said, if you've got a little bit of color, put a chartreuse tip on it or a red tip or something. But I guarantee you that wacky worm can produce fish this time of year when almost nothing else will do it. Number two behind that would be a tube jig. Once again, check my channel out on YouTube. I've got a video out there for how to rig and how to fish the tube jig, which is just an awesome fish catching bait this time of year. You can literally catch everything that swims on a tube bait this time of year. Once again, throw the 3-inch, throw the 4-inch. You can throw it out there and reel it back, hopping the rod tip to make that thing look like it's swimming, or you can fish it on bottom like you would a Texas rig or a jig and pig, something in between. That's just an extremely versatile bait this time of year. And sometimes, if you're looking for fish or you're just wanting to catch anything out there, that tube bait is just an awesome thing to throw. You can catch crappie on it. You'll catch stripers, hybrids, and bass on it. You'll catch everything that swims in the lake on that tube jig. And once again, rig it up right with 6 to 8 pound spinning tackle type situations, 6.5 foot rod or a little more, medium light, light depending on which direction you're going there, 1/8 ounce head. And I guarantee you can catch a lot of fish on that tube jig, and then of course the last part of that series for me would be a jig and pig. Man, it's hard to beat a jig and pig for catching quality fish this time of year when those fish are really neutral. You can fish those brush piles around boat docks. You can fish those stump beds. You can fish known brush piles in shallower water, or just big slab rocks or chunk rocks in many cases, like in some of our other reservoirs. And that jig and pig, if there's a fish in there, he'll eat that jig and pig. Don't overfish the jig and pig when you're fishing it around this kind of timber. Let it do the work for you. Sometimes you have to throw that jig in a brush pile or throw it out there and let it soak. Just let it sit there for a little while before you move it. And I guarantee you, using that, you will catch that fish in that brush pile because he will eat that thing. No problem. And, of course, last but not least, you can't leave out topwaters. Sometimes topwaters, if you got a little chop on the water, you can just have a ball this time of year because it so mimics a dying or injured shad on top of the water, and you can cover a little more water, fish a little faster, and sometimes produce a lot of fish on the topwaters. So don't leave the topwater out of your arsenal for looking for these fall fish. Some of my favorite locations be secondary points, shallow water humps, windy banks in the back of pockets where you have, if the wind's blowing out south, it's on the north side of the lake, it's been blowing the shad up in that pocket or up in that cove or up in that little bitty creek, and go all the way to the back of that thing when you fish it. Sometimes these fish will just migrate all the way back, and because that's where the easy food is, and they're back there just chowing down. Not all bass begin to shift here at the same time as far as the fall locations, and certainly not all of them move the same distance during this period. Like I said, the two factors that govern where you need to look for these fish is the concentrations of shad, and of course the second one is structure. Even bass that are migrating from one area to another, they do not move all at once, but they do move in common places or common holding areas. So once you're catching fish in a particular area, look for those areas. Folks, send me an email, tell us how you like the show or how we can improve on it. If you have a suggestion for a topic, let us know and we'll try to put a show together for you. Folks, don't forget, Jstfish Outdoors is available for speaking engagements and fishing seminars. If you would like to know more about Jstfish Outdoors or how we can help, just drop us a line, JustFishOutdoors@justfish.com. That's with a JST, folks. You can also find us on Facebook at Jstfish Outdoors. You can get a hold of us there as well. Folks, get out and enjoy one of the many lakes or streams we're blessed to have here in the great state of Oklahoma. With the fall coming on, the trees are going to be turning colors. It's just going to be a magnificent time to be on the water and enjoying all of the scenery here in Oklahoma. Thanks for listening. Be sure to catch us next week for the same time.